Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I appreciate you being here. This week we have guests Cal Dietz and Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Cal Dietz is the co-author of Triphasic Training and strength coach at the University of Minnesota. Mike T. Nelson is an expert in exercise physiology, neurological aspects of training, and metabolic flexibility. Together, they have authored Triphasic Training II, which has just been released. And on the show today, they'll be covering neurological concepts in performance training and agility, oscillatory strength training, the evolution of warm-ups, athletic capacity building, and much more. Let's get to episode 445 with Cal Dietz and Mike T. Nelson. Cal, Mike, great to have you guys on the show and excited for our conversation today.
Thank you.
Yeah, can't wait to get it. Thanks, Joel. Appreciate it. Been a long time, buddy.
It has. And, speaking of a long time, I think, after I bought Triphasic Training back in 2012 or 13, I don't remember how long after that I asked you about Triphasic Training II, but I know this has been in the works for a while. And so what got you two together? And what led to this book getting written between the two of you?
Well, I think, Mike worked here at university. He just worked in the lab right down while he was getting his PhD just down the hallway. And then, we started trading ideas and I'd run stuff by him and then I had all this new stuff and then his inputs and feedback were in parallel to me, maybe just creating more and more stuff. Right. And we were having just good conversations and it's like, well, let's get this, let's do Triphasic 2 together. Cause between your insight of physiology and everything that you can help me with, like we were just able to a pretty good, two different perspectives, like a raw coach and someone that coaches people, that works people out and actually would try. Like he's the only researcher I ever knew that like would actually just like test stuff and be like, what they're telling me is not right, right? like what I've learned over the years doesn't seem to be right. Like how is this possible? So it's awesome, right? Somebody with a different perspective than pure academia that isn't gonna just only believe what he's learned.
Yeah, the running joke when I was at the U of M is I would be the Cal translator. So I wasn't on his staff or anything, but I would just hang around and annoy people. And then I'd sit in some of the meetings and then some of the assistants and the people afterwards would be like, okay, so what do you actually say? I'm like, well, you can just go ask him if you want. Like, what? I don't want him to know that I don't know. And I'm like, oh, well, I think it was this, and this. Oh, okay.
Yeah. But again, I think that comes from a space where most people, they only know what they've been taught and they don't think beyond like a little bit more. You know what I mean, Joel? Like, you know what I'm talking about, obviously, with your podcast. And there's just questions that people don't ask. They live in their little box of their knowledge and then they resist the getting out of that box, right? It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And for me, it was nice to talk to Cal and be like, hey, what do you think about this? And he's like, 8 years ago, we had the $50,000 force place and we put people in the squat rack and we did this, and we did that. And I was like, oh, wow, like someone had a similar idea, but he's actually tested it on hundreds of different athletes and actually has data. Where a lot of other coaches, you would ask them about stuff and they would be like, well, I don't do that, or I've never thought of that, or I don't know, I think this works, but almost none of them ran the experiment and didn't have any data to say either way. So I was like, oh, wow, this is cool. Like someone actually has tested shit. This is amazing.
Yeah, it's
right. And the biggest thing I think, Joel, with all that is I test a lot, and people, when you see that, like 2 summers ago, I got 250,000 numbers on my athletes to figure out some 1080 stuff, right? That I felt I needed to learn. But and it's not that people will go, well, you're pretty smart. I'm like, no, it's not that I'm smart, because obviously Mike's a lot smarter than me, I feel, but it's the fact that they just can't get outside their comfort zone, right? They just can't ask questions or they're just afraid to. And like me and Mike both have said to each other, I feel like an idiot, right? Like at some point. So. But anyway, the deal, Joel, asking these questions and in all the years you've been in this with your mindset, like it's not that people aren't smart or they live in their shell. And then that, I think it also limits their creativeness too, don't you?
Yeah, I think, the characteristic or a characteristic, as I sound that word out slowly, but of success is the willingness to be wrong early. And I think that goes in tandem with curiosity, because, even having curiosity, there is, I think, a little bit of, you have to admit you don't know, and you also have to be willing that curiosity could lead you to being wrong. And then you have to be wrong enough times, and eventually you can work your way through it. I know something you had mentioned, Cal, even with Triphasic 1 was, breaking enough eggs and baking a cake. And, one of these days, I don't know if we went through this in any original shows, but like all the iterations of before the original Triphasic, I'd love to talk about. Like, before whatever led to that, what was like the most beta version back in like 2007 or 2008, like what?
Well, I mean, in 202, right? Like, I think I did isometrics first and then eccentrics afterward. And I tried to mix them. I tried all the variables, right? And the one that always seemed to stick was the eccentric for a couple of weeks and then the isos, right? But I tried variations of each combination, whether it was daily, weekly. I tried it within one workout, and a lot of things got results, Joe, especially with my younger athletes, but
Sure.
The experienced kids, right? Like, so there was a lot of, it was just really trying a cycle at a time and, and maybe exercises that were maybe too aggressive where, hey, we got sore, things happen, but and then things didn't work right away, but eventually they got better, but like, well, maybe it was just too much for that time, right? Especially with the track and field community. It was nice that I had two coaches, track and field and swimming, who were willing to let me experiment so that we could win a Big Ten title at the end of the year. And that they were so unbelievable. Dennis Dale and Phil Lundeen, right? They were unbelievable Big Ten strength or Big Ten track and field and swimming coaches. So.
Yeah, believe it or not, I don't know if I told you this, Cal, but I tried to record a podcast with Phil London. And the audio, that was way back in the day. I still have maybe clips of the audio. Something went wrong with the audio recording and I just couldn't post it. And I felt that's like the lost podcast. If I could post one podcast, man, I go back, I listened to parts of it just for my own sake. Cause that guy, I mean, he was Big Ten Coach of the Year. The 4x400s at Minnesota were insane. And then he went and coached like cross country and won a national championship too. Yeah. So it's like just a great coach, and I know just being a strength coach, being able to work with elite like track and swim coaches, you learn so much from them. I've picked up so much, and it's really cool to have the opportunity.
He just got inducted in the Hall of Fame, USA Track and Field Hall of Fame, right? And you're going like my perspective, and he had a PhD in biomechanics. Right. I don't know if he probably mentioned that, but he never really did. But when he would watch something and then he would talk me through it, you're like, this is where I learned my biomechanics, practical biomechanics. I was like, oh, I see what he means. I see, you know what I mean? Just, hey, you got to realize the tendon at this point, like this particular movement's not going to be as intense as this one. And, and then you're just going, wow, this guy, he's been there. He's legendary, right? To take the 400 teams that we had, or just the whole team, right? Like we weren't getting the best recruits in track and field, but we were winning Big Ten championships. So that was awesome. Anyways, he's my mentor. He's my number one mentor ever.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant guy. With you guys working together as well, Cal, you mentioned it with Mike, the physiology piece. And I do think there is something to it is interesting because there's applied and there's research, but then ultimately you want research that is applied or that works off of applied experience on some level. I know, Mike, you've posted plenty of lifting workouts that you do personally. And I'm curious what the connections are in terms of maybe, Mike, what have you taken from Cal in the strength realm that you have put in your own practice over time that has made you think, oh, okay, and maybe made you think a little bit differently about things from more of the scientific or the physiological perspective? I had originally framed that question as what do you just have in common? Very general, but specifically speaking, I'm curious what you've picked up from Cal from that side that you've put to work.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the two main things are even just the framework of triphasic and adapting that to whatever level athletes you have. And I may not, as some are intermediate to advanced athletes, I will have different blocks of triphasic and it may be on a specific lift. But even just the components get worked into a lot of stuff. Like I may do very slow eccentrics with newer clients on purpose and not worry too much about the concentric or the isometric. And I've noticed that just their form is better, their ability to learn the lift is better. They're probably less likely to get injured because we're slowing them down, especially if they're using a machine or things like that. So just taking those concepts and figuring out different ways you can kind of bake them in for different levels of athletes. And then the second part, which is more recently, is kind of on the coordinated conditioning component of, yes, there is still an interference effect, right? You don't see, power lifters winning marathons. And yes, if you're not really that trained, do most people have to worry about it? Probably not. But I think that we'll learn in the future that you can still get a better result by trying to match some things up or splitting them apart. So for years, even before I talked to Cal about this, I realized having intermediate level athletes do the aerobic stuff in the morning and then lift in the afternoon was better than having them lift and do a moderate aerobic stuff right after. Even though they probably were not based on the literature would say, that probably doesn't matter. But I just noticed when I was able to split them, they got better and better results all the time. So again, it's back to what does the literature show? But then just thinking about, okay, what are the actual principles? If we want to push the organism in one direction, how long are those adaptations going to last? Aerobic stuff, might be, a couple hours. Strength, hypertrophy, remodeling, maybe 24, 48, 72 hours if you look at protein synthetic responses and stuff. So just setting those up that if the athlete doesn't care what they do, hey, I might as well set it up on what I, theoretically think is going to be better and then look at the results. Now, if you've got someone who can only get to the session for a gym and they can only do 1 hour and that's all they can do, and your option is having them do cardio after or having them do no cardio, then of course, doing cardio is going to be better than not doing it. But once you get into the area where they can do it, I think back to the just thinking creatively, allow yourself the freedom to just play with it, and I realized if I split those out, people just got better results over time, and that, ended up chatting with Cal about that, and that matches a lot of stuff he's seen at a much higher level too.
Yeah, I the splitting of the training, like looking at the old Russian manuals and like what time of day, and there's so much good stuff there, and that's something I forget if I had read that before. Back in my 20s at Wilmington College, my first coaching job, full-time coaching job, I remember, at least on the strength days, a couple days a week, I tried to get people to go. I couldn't do it the other way because of logistics, but I at least tried to get my athletes to come in early to do lifting if they could on their schedule. And every time they could split those days, it was strength and tempo sprints on the same day, and then the other day would be a power day. But if they could split it, that was always awesome. And I always did that myself too. And again, logistics, it's not always possible, but if you can, it's great. And it's one of those things where, hey, the answers were in the past there. People have figured this stuff out, and now...
Oh, yeah. And it's not new.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not new. Yeah, for sure. I like to, something that with the original Triphasic, and I know we'll talk about, hopefully, like some brain-based and neural ideas on this show. But sometimes, I don't know if you guys experience this, or maybe feel free to chime in, but a lot of times, like you'll do a program or experience a program, and then maybe you don't do it for a while, and then maybe you come back to it years later and you see it in a new light. And with the eccentrics, Mike, you mentioned this. I think a lot of teams do this, and I think a lot of it's because of the Triphasic book. I mean, clearly tempo has existed for who knows how long, forever. But I think a lot of the inspiration for a lot of tempos has been driven by the original Triphasic book. And I'll hear sometimes in the weight room, the beeper's on, and people are doing, okay, we're doing eccentric phase. And outside of just muscle physiology and adaptations, I think about, well, the brain is paying attention to this because you're also forcing, and now you could say the metronome's boring. Maybe you have music that has beats per minute. You figure that out. If it's 120 BPM, you could do that. Maybe it's more interesting in some sense. But the bottom line is like, wow, the brain pays attention to this as well. So if you were doing, I mean, again, lifting is exciting and interesting already for a lot of people, but just to see and frame something up from an attention perspective in a new way is so powerful as well. So that's something for me, like going back and just thinking about it years after, I was like, okay, wow, that's really interesting. And I think about that with those types of phases as well. And I know we'll get into the capacity. I really want to talk about the capacity conditioning, like some of those dual nature things, because I think sometimes today it's kind of split, like do no conditioning, we don't, and coming from an age where we did too much conditioning and that kind of thing. So that's, I do really want to dig into that. But I am curious if, and maybe with like the Triphasic 2 updates, is there anything that as this whole system has evolved and progressed, anything seen in a new light or anything that's really a key to the Triphasic II book and system and some of the methods that are lied in there or lie within there?
I think, the goat drill, what shocked me with the goat drill was that Joe, I had kids that just seemed to be a little bit can't do this with maybe this right leg as well, or they tell me, hey, I typically do 17 extra reps with this leg and I only get a 13 with this one. Well, and sometimes I could fix it with RPR and get it up, but then it was like all of a sudden with the goat drill, some of those things were just taken off the table and things seemed to match. And I'm just like, and a lot of these kids had like high driven personalities at times, you know what I mean? So I think they were so, and I think it could be the environment of so much dopamine getting shoved into our brain with everything we do. And that the goat drill can be a stimulant, but yet it can also kind of synchronize the brain up. And it just seemed to like connect everything, which then led me to dropping my warm-ups eventually, right? Like I'm literally at 40,000 plus workouts. Maybe I'm just saying 40,000, like cautiously, because I'm sure it's 50 to 60, but people don't, they come here, and I had a track guy this summer come in and visit me. And he's like, okay, the kids came in, they're standing around, they're doing their RPR. They go up, they do one goat drill, and then they're doing 103% on the 1080, right? 6 minutes into the workout, it's at 3:36 in the morning. And he's like, how many hamstrings you pulled? I'm like, I haven't pulled any yet. Maybe my kids aren't fast enough to pull hamstrings, I guess. But like, yeah, it's just what it is. But I think it's the brain aspect, right? That, and then also, some huge factors of the best athletes I've ever dealt with was the ability to relax the muscle, right? And when everything's coordinated, Joel, that the antagonists relax really fast. And then with that, those people are more powerful. So, I've also know relative weight of power per kilogram, right? Like those are your monsters in the weight room, those kids that are producing that high level. But you also have to have coordination to do that, right? So, and then the high speed stuff that we do with all the oscillatories, right? It's just a highly coordinated. People want to talk about coordination and relaxation. We literally have caught that with the TMG tensiomyograph, showing how fast the muscle can learn to shut off by using the oscillatories at high speed, high velocity, right? So the biggest thing is, I know, hey, everyone wants to train the muscle, but the brain controls everything. And to me, like, I'm trying to create the most brain-friendly training exercise that I can. And when I say that, like, yes, I have people that do an exercise to get off. We test balance with eyes closed, no sound. Bam, their balance is worse. They do another exercise, and the balance is better. So I picked the better exercise, right? So it's more really about the brain and brain-friendly stuff. And I think the goat drill was the one key component to that.
Yeah. Just quickly, I know you've talked about the goat drill. I know probably a majority of people listening have seen it in some way, shape, or form. But can you just describe quickly? I know there's a lot of adaptations too. I was looking through the book, and there's a lot of different ways to go with it. But the base layer, how you got it, how you came up with it. I don't think you've told that story. And then maybe we could talk about the adaptations and what goes into it. I also want to get into warm-ups because I love what you said there, but maybe let's start there first.
Yeah. Well, the foundation was a doctor. It was exposed to me, Dr. Sandek out of Buffalo, New York. She's a psychologist. And what she realized is the right and left hemisphericity of the brains and a lot of kids that had behavioral problems were actually, they weren't connecting, right? And we're talking with ADD, just different types of behavioral problems. And I actually had an intern that worked at one of her clinics here. So, and he was talking about it, but, he confirmed everything like that I was talking about, but like ultimately, and what it is a figure eight. And then as you walk in this figure eight pattern, the kids would look at one object the whole time. So they never leave their eyes. So you have to do the figure eight so that, they don't lose their object, but they're looking to the right side as they're walking. They're looking to the left side. So that was the foundation of the drill. But then I realized like, hey, this is good. I know my kids are stimulated. They come in sometimes. Their days are off. Well, maybe this drill can actually get them back on, right? Because they're not their typical self today. Well, and I tried it and we sped it up. And then right when we started doing that, then what happened was I had a kid that transferred in with concussion, was cleared for 4 months. And he got sick when he started doing the drill. So I knew the drill not that that's good, but I knew the drill was making an impact on these athletes, right? And I could just see things happen, like I mentioned before. And then in the summer, we make it very advanced, right? If you search Olympic goat drill on my YouTube page, there's an Olympian doing it, and it is terrifying how fast those two athletes are doing it, right? And he was a 19-year-old Olympian and signed a $70 million deal, I think. So he's a real deal athlete, right? He's professional now, but the catch is that if people look at that one and say, hey, that's really advanced, I don't have to set it. Mm-hmm. The point is you don't have to set it up. Like on game day, my athletes will start the goat drill. They'll do one rep. They do a figure 8 around some cones up in the concourse, wherever we're playing at. They'll do a tennis ball around their waist at every 25. So they count down from 100 by threes. And at every 75, 50, and 25, they switch their hands in different directions just to cause some like more confusion or more things to think about. And they count down by threes, and they do one rep. They go down to 100. And when they're done, their brain is locked in. That's the one rep we do. It takes them probably 20 to 30 seconds, maybe at the most. And they do one rep of that, and that's it. It's pretty, they feel confident. It just literally turns them on, and you can make any variation you want. And the magic behind it, we talk about in the book, is it releases three neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, dopamine, and epinephrine, right? And then and it's not just that. There's the stuff with the vision that Mike gave in detail in the book, where he could have wrote 2 more chapters. I know, Mike, but like the benefits of that, Mike, alone that you want to mention.
Yeah, I mean, related to that exactly. The first time Cal showed me, he's like, "Hey, man, I got this new drill. You got to check this out." And he showed me a video of it. And my first response was like, what the hell? You've lost your mind at this point. He's like, "No, man, this is really working. It's really good." And I started thinking about it, and I'm like, oh, holy crap. Like, if you think about what high level athletic movement is of any form, you have to coordinate visual information. You have to coordinate vestibular information. You have to coordinate proprioceptive information. And when you're doing the goat drill, you have to do all of those. Now you add a cognitive component on it, like dual tasking, like you're counting down numbers. And I realized, I'm like, oh, so this is actually integration of all of it. And I think the first question I asked you was, so your athletes are not very good. How well do they perform this drill? And you're like, horrible. And I'm like, cool. Well, that makes sense then, right? Because they are less adept at coordinating all of those senses together. So my background, I'm an associate professor at the Kerrigan Institute. So they do a lot of, functional neurology, clinical neurology, more for pathologies and some for performance, of looking at, okay, when these things break down, like what do you actually see? And I know, Cal's done a lot of work with Dr. Adam Klotzik and those people in the past too. So it's a cool way of integrating all these different things. And the hard part with the book was to, kind of get them in a series, because if you show them the advanced drill to most athletes, they're like, I'm never going to be able to do that. And then just don't do it. So how do you back up and regress it all the way to a version they can do, and then have all the progressions from there?
Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, that's with the drill too. I know, Cal, you mentioned going to figure 8. I believe that the base version is you're facing whatever you're looking at the whole time. So if like you're side shuffling, you're back pedaling, you're not like, it's not like you're being chased. It's a facing, so that the body has to go through all 4 quad or whatever. It probably an infinite level of action degree changes, but basically, not just running. You're facing like the wall or the thing you're looking at the whole time.
Right. Yeah. And, the foundation was Affinity Walks, Joel. And I've had a number of people reach out to me, especially friends who were athletic, and they're like, hey, my daughter, my son's not that coordinated. He's going through a growth spurt. And I said, hey, do this Affinity Walk, have him watch TV, read subtitles, feel better for 10 minutes, 3 times a week. And they were like, oh, the coordination came back like rather fast. I was like, it's just the hemisphericities and things weren't connected, right? Like, I think every kid should be doing this drill. If you're going to let them play video games, like even young adult, like the young teenagers, Joel, like the remote control, like with the video gaming. Why not have, if you're going to let them play video games, make them do that, right? Like, I think it'd be a great tool.
The little brain break. Yeah, my kids are 8, 6, and 1. And they have the little brain breaks or whatever, and it's mostly jumping, which is great. It's great, gets kids moving, they're excited. But yeah, to have the upgrade will be some sort of figure eight or infinity loop, right?
Of course.
But it's interesting to think, coaching youth sports, like coaching youth soccer, you see this so early, is the good athletes, they play faster. And on one level, you could say, okay, well, they're just faster. Yeah, I guess like fast twitch and, skeletal tendon, whatever, nervous system. But in many ways, I see that they also just process the game faster. They're fearless. They feel comfortable in their environment combined with the physical intelligence. And there's something about that goes beyond just, well, they're fast. In many cases they are, but you just see the kids who are fearless and play fast. And I think there's something to be said about fearlessness and like a multi-layered integration of your environment. And the base level of that being, can you walk in a figure eight, forwards, backwards, side to side, while having a fixed visual field? Because for someone who doesn't have the apparatus, that would be a little scary. It might be something where there's a slowdown. And so one of the things that I think is that I'm always drawn to, and I was going to say, Mike, I knew you had a lot of like neurological education. I think, because I was thinking in my mind, I've forgotten about Carrick, but I'd gone to like the Z Health thing a long time ago. I think you've done that. Yeah. And I think sometimes with the neurological stuff, somewhere I can get lost and sometimes frustrated is if it's really isolated. Like, here's this one little thing. And I've seen practitioners mess around with one little thing for like 20 minutes. And I'm just sitting there like, ugh, like, let's do something else, and I think about Rafe Kelly, this phrase will always stick with me, is train at the highest possible level of complexity. And I think there's something in that, meaning let's do the most athletic thing you're capable of doing. And I think about something like the goat drill being, hey, this is more athletic and integrated, and you're kind of dragging up the other systems along with you in some way, rather than messing. I'm sure there's areas where you need to mess around more. I shouldn't say mess around, but zoom in.
Right.
But to me, it seems like it's a great place to integrate things without the need for that and letting the body problem solve. I'd be curious on your perspective, Mike, having gone into the zooming in and out too. I just because of my bias is, well, hey, let's just do this instead and let it solve the problems because it's simple and I understand it. So, anyways, I'd be curious what your take is on that interchange.
Yeah, I think you can use it as, how I view it, is using it also as a diagnostic, right? One thing that, I did Z Health early on, one thing that stuck with me from Dr. Cobb was that if you see kids who do not move athletically, there's something off with them. Now, modern day, that could be maybe just too much exposure to video games, or they could be, they have, like I have, some severe eye issues, vestibular issues, etc. Something's off about it that you would need to do something. So having a bunch of kids do the goat drill, I would be interested to see which kids can do it well and which kids are kind of struggling. Yeah. The ones that are struggling, maybe we can just give them more reps. Like you said, a lot of times their brain and body will figure it out. If they can't figure it out, now I'm going to take that and I'm going to go to the next level down, and then I'm going to go to more, air quote, singular type things to see what's actually missing within that.
Cool.
I think most people, if all those systems are working well, it's just a matter of getting the reps to get the coordination between the systems. But you will find some people who they're missing, certain parts of, eye movements or vestibular movements or whatever. If you can isolate that particular movement, train that up so that it's just no longer an issue. And then now when they do things like the goat drill, they can reintegrate it at a much higher level. So for example, in my case, I do a lot of kiteboarding, and let's see, about 4 years ago, I did a whole week of, intensive neuro rehab with my buddy, Dr. Jeremy Schmo. And then after that, when I did a jump, for the first time in my life, I could tell I was dropping without having to take visual information. So I was missing that gravastat, that component of my vestibular system. And so we did a whole bunch of work to upregulate that and to train it. But as soon as my brain realized I could use that, the integration of it was super fast. Meaning that the second I did my first jump, I realized, oh my God, I can tell when I'm falling now. This is kind of cool. So if you have big deficits, I think there is a time and a place to be more specific and then it'd allow you to be a better integrative. But if you're training people on a group level, most people, I would argue, just need more reps, but also watch for those kids who, even with all the reps, are still kind of struggling. Then you would need to be more specific to figure out what's going on with them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. With what you said, Eric Cobb said. I've heard this from Jeff Moyer as well. As we think about these unathletic, air quotes, kids, that's just they're just motor morons. They're just not coordinated. Well, what does that mean? And it is interesting, even with my own children. Like my son, who's 6, is really coordinated. Like he's doing flips onto the couch, and like he can do it. I guess that's just for lack of a better word. He can do it. But my daughter, she's already in like deeper pairs of glasses. She's a lot more timid on the field. You just know the way she's perceiving her environment is different. And maybe she does a different sport at some point, and I think in some perspective, those, based off how you perceive the world around you can lead to what physical activity you ultimately choose. A lot of times when we get these groups who are more advanced, like a college level or pro level, how many pro or even college level athletes are you going to get who have severe deficiencies? I'm sure you get some, but like at that point, it's not going to be, it's not going to be that.
They just don't make it there.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not going to make it. And so but that's why I think like the goat drill is probably, on the college level, especially, it seems like it's more performance. Maybe high school or middle school, it could be even more diagnostic, because you're probably going to get a lot more middle schoolers or whatever. Probably not more. That's the age you lose that coordination and growth spurts too. But like, I would imagine the lower level you give that drill to, it becomes more and more and more diagnostic, because you're going to see, oh, wow, you struggle with this. And versus you get a group of pretty athletic people, they're probably going to be decent. But then, Cal, you talked about like, okay, well, now that you're good at this, you can do this. Now let's up the complexity. You said, now let's like take a tennis ball around your back. And I was even thinking, the thing that popped in my head, and this is just because it's always on my radar, but how does my own mental and emotional background impact my sport? Like, especially I'm a streaky player. I'm thinking like my fears and my goals and my process goals or something while I'm doing it, like think of that. But I like, that you had talked about this in the book, and you've talked about this in the podcast, like the hockey players who could process more, like while doing these things. Like there's that level of physical safety and processing power, like a computer chip, right? Like they can just process more. And you want to share a little bit about that and how so maybe start by sharing, okay, basic goat drill, and then how are we advancing that processing power the more an athlete can take in?
Yeah, well, you can do the simplest goat drill and it works well, and how we integrate and bring it into our system. So I throw the most advanced one out there as soon as we start our summer workouts, right? And are they good at it? No, but again, that frustration is a key factor. If you're frustrated and you're pushing yourself on all these different levels with all these, right? The brain goes, I have to release these neurotransmitters, right? And it's been talked about how kids learn when they get frustrated, right? So if your kid is struggling to buckle their seatbelt, don't just reach back and do it for them. Like have them try to do that, because that frustration will help them learn the process, right? So, but the things that we do in the advanced one is, we do the hands around the waist. There's tons of options where while they're doing it, like in one of the drills, another frustration thing is that we'll put somebody inside the circles in our summer, and then they block their face, which is eerily frustrating for anybody, right? But, and you can hear guys stop counting when you get the hand in your face, right? So the goal is to keep them going. We have little hurdles there that they have to be aware of, that they have to step over. We cut up, like in the wicket drills for proper foot strike. I got that from Chris Corfus, where we would cut up little pieces of the flooring and just lay it down there. So the brain, instead of doing all these heel strikes in that drill, now they were running around the circle without a bat, with not doing the poor heel strike, right, where they would land more midfoot. So it was put them in better position, because the brain, while they're doing the goat drill, counting down, bowl around the waist, watching an object, and then you would be like, oh, now I got to land so that if I slip, I'm not going to pull a hamstring. So like that's another factor. You can put people on the side, like just smack them as they go by. So if you got a line waiting for people, you can just smack them. The other variable that we put in the advanced one was that to just get more people through the drill, you're 5 steps behind, and you're going to chase that person through the drill, right? So being chased is one factor that kind of stimulates the brain, and chasing somebody is another for the guy in the back. So we're able to get more ripped through more drills and more people, and That's just another factor. And, if you had a TV screen, I think it would be great if it just flashed. Like if you had if we were some D1 football program, we'd have like a big screen that could you would track the number. It just kept changing and you would subtract 3 on that. Right. So you could that would be an awesome upgrade tool to do that. But, so Joel, when we work out, it's basically we do one goat drill, and then we do our 1080 sprint protocol, 1 rep. And then we come back, and while they're resting, they do the goat drill again. Yeah. And so we end up doing 4 to 5 goat drills before the workout. And it's really just 2 reps through a triple. There's ways we set it up with 3 circles or 2, whatever you want to do. But we go through it 2 reps, and then they go back, and then they do their sprint, whatever the protocol is that day for that person. And then we do 4 to 5 reps of the goat drill while we're resting, 4 to 5 reps of the sprint, and then we're off to the weight room. And that's kind of how we do it. And again, what we've seen is just these kids can learn skill better. And I've gotten emails from coaches, high school football coaches, like, a kid could never catch over his left shoulder for whatever reason. So they always had him on. Well, now he's catching over the left shoulder when they started integrating that drill, right, in their passing drills and stuff. So it those are the fun things that I get. I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool that a coach started doing this drill. And then there's kids that were suffering. They couldn't perform that they saw. And you'll probably see greater results in high school for something like that, right? Because at my level, I mean, my kids can handle a puck. Like some of these kids have been touched by God with their skill set, right? So you're going, but you can still see them get better, right? You can still see them get better. Sometimes they don't know because I can see it or my assistants can see it, but they're like, wow, he can do this much better. So, it's not even the goat drill. It's just the athleticism and all the other things that we're talking about. And again, let's face it. In my opinion, if everything's locked in and the brain's running smooth per se from all the tests they've taken in the phone that day, or they go to the game and everything's locked in the brain, you're less likely, in my opinion, to get injured. You're able to react to maybe somebody coming at your knee. You know what I mean? Those are the things, your ability to process all this information that's going on in the field. So you're less likely to get injured. Like, I think that's the biggest thing in the coach drill, not just becoming a better athlete, but I truly believe you're less likely to be injured because of that.
I like an idea that has been more and more solidified in my head is the idea of just anchors. So if you're learning neurology, like to have something to anchor it to, regardless of whether you're on the more clinical side, the more performance side, you can meet in the middle and like, okay, here's the anchor. How did an athlete do with this? How can I manipulate this for wherever I lie on that spectrum? And also even between sports performance and sport, it's an anchor because like that athlete who couldn't look over their shoulder, I'd imagine, well, what if you did that drill too? Like, and the target is like behind you and you have to look over your shoulder the whole time or something. You know what I'm saying? Like
exactly.
you could manipulate that, or maybe you do it with one eye or whatever. It may be something, a more clinical piece if you have a one side. I don't know that far into that, but I imagine there's also more zoomed in constraints that you could place in that. And then you're always looping it back into that thing. I wanted to say something you said that was so cool that I love, just because I wrote an email that was along these lines recently. It's a topic I'm so passionate about, just because you see so many warm-ups and just the way that sport is done and warm-ups and training is so robotic. It's just easily mindless. It's all right, get in line, do this. And play is amazing. And I love infusing play when I can, but play doesn't have to just be a game. It's just, it's attention. It's deep attention. What draws deep attention? A game is the easiest and it's an amazing way to do it. Yeah. I do it all the time, but like I warm athletes up for high jump practice. We start with a tennis ball and we do all sorts of chases on one leg, like passing back and forth, hopping on one leg with a partner, things like that, because it drives attention instantly. And it's not like get in line, do the drill, I think there's a place for those things, but it just sounds like you've taken your warm-up process to something that instantly, I mentioned it even with the tempos and the metronome, it's instantly driving attention. And I just think that's something that the longer I've been coaching, like that is my gold, is what is the attentional state of the athletes, even no matter how far you want to go into it with it does this with the brain, or it's just, hey, they're paying attention, they're engaged. I just think that to me, that's the starting point. And I think there's different ways to do that. But in a situation too, where it's like, maybe it's pro athletes. And if you start playing like ultimate Frisbee with them, the manager might be like, hey, what are some ways that we can get this group to drive attention? in a different way. And it seems like that would also be a phenomenal way to accomplish that.
Yeah, they have fun with it, right? And I think people have to understand, like, the drill doesn't have to be perfect. Matter of fact, I don't want it perfect, right? Because then it's too easy.
Yeah.
So the complexity is what you're trying to push, right? That's why you put somebody in there, even a really simple go drill, if they're getting chased, man, they turn up the heat, right? Both of them, like, it's exciting, right? Like, so that's phenomenal. And then even I have athletes that might come back from rehab and they start to go drill, and you'd be shocked at how much they've regressed just because they've been, and not even because the leg's not functional or the shoulder's not. It's just they haven't done athletic stuff, and you're like, this person was a master at the go drill this summer, spent 6 weeks because of a broken bone, can run normal. But when they go to do the go drill, it's like their first time, because I think things aren't connected. Does that make sense, Mike? In that regression of time when they're just not that athleticism like has happened?
Yeah, I would argue it's definitely a lack of practice because they're probably young enough. It's not really quite permanent or semi-permanent. And I'd also argue that it's probably a reintegration of the proprioceptive and visual and vestibular components that are now slightly different because of the injury that they had. So they need to kind of remap that whole area and then reintegrate it again, especially if it's post-injury.
Yeah. And that's what we're seeing, right? Like, the go drill's terrible. Next couple of weeks, they get a lot better at it. Maybe where they were. Like, that's because of all that reintegration, Joel, that has to happen that Mike just talked about.
Yeah. I'd be curious too, just briefly, as long as we're on that topic of vestibular and some of the systems, either of your takes on like rolling, like flipping, like in my head, I'm thinking Jeremy Frisch is always posting, like, with youth training, kids jumping off trampolines and flipping through the air and those types of things. And obviously, like, you could do crawls and rolls or forward rolls or backward rolls or anything like that. I think I look at, like, all the ways you could draw attention and play, and to me, that's always a part that you could easily do as well. It's not staying on the ground, but I'd be curious, any thoughts on those types of movements or manipulations as well? I mean, I guess at college weight room, with all these athletes, you're probably not gonna be able to get a trampoline and a crash pad and say, all right, let's do flips and stuff. Like, that's probably not the appropriate time for that necessarily. But curious with some of those more rolling other types of aerial integrations in training, either in college or general population, and working with that.
Go ahead, Mike.
I mean, my thoughts is, especially if your kids, like, just enroll them in gymnastics, get them as much movement as they can, especially when those critical windows are open. Like, the Russians had that whole system, pretty much, figured out because of the way their system was set up, for better or worse. But you can look at that. With adults, usually I'm looking at where they're missing, and then how does that affect their output. Like Cal was saying, with balance, you can do muscle testing, you can do range of motion testing, you can just watch them move. And in my case, if you have a fair amount more on the, I don't know if you'd say defects, but movements you're trying to integrate. For example, like, my two main rehab-y drills now are lateral fast movement and shift to the right, walk back to the left, fast movement to the right, lie down, roll backwards over to the right and back up. So that will basically kind of reset my nervous system, range of motion goes up, movement fluidity goes up. So in my case, because I'm trying to make those more permanent, because they do increase my quality of output, I'll sometimes do those during my lifting session or during whatever I'm doing to increase the quality of that session. It does look batshit crazy if you're at a main gym and you're sitting down on the floor, rolling back and forth, and no one knows what the hell you're doing, but I don't really care. So I think in some people who need very specific stuff, who are a little bit, further down, I think you can do that. I think integrating it. So a simple thing, if you've got a bigger group class, I would say integrate those movements. And what I used to do when I was more in person is I would have a lot of water breaks, and I put the water fountain, like, I'd train people so they had to walk to the water fountain. And it wasn't so much that I really cared about them getting water. It was a way for me to spy and to watch their gait patterns the whole time. So I would see some people where, hey, we just did this, vestibular, this rolling motion. Cool. Everyone there looks good. Ooh, that person, they got worse. Right. And so I'm going to see if that pattern happens again. And then I may do something different with that. So if you have a way of subconsciously, or I'd say you're conscious, but they're subconscious, watching their movement patterns to see what happens, to make sure that you're not doing something that may be too far in degrading some of those patterns. But I'd say overall, the more variety and the more of the things you can put in for vast majority of people, I think that's going to be a win.
I love the rolls, the flips, and all the variables in there. Like, it just feels people eventually just look more athletic when they move, right?
Yeah, and you usually like it. You can just ask them, like, "Hey, did you like that drill?" They're like, "Yeah, it was cool." If they're like, "I hated it, scared the shit out of me," it's like, okay, then that might be a little too much for you.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I remember from going to, I just did like the basic Z Health, whatever the pre-level is, but that one of the things that stuck with me, I thought was interesting, that's not often talked about, is that it's like there's a amount, it's like dosage with anything. There's a dosage with how much sprinting you can do, distance, strength, medicine, and the same thing with things that are attuning the nervous system. And you can do too much. And they would do tests like, okay, like if you did too many reps and your nervous system fell out beyond the point where it could coordinate it safely, you would lose range of motion or things like that. And I found that interesting. And sometimes I think, especially if you are someone who sits on the more athletic side, like, oh, these things are never a problem for you. I mean, if I go and do like 3 forward rolls across the floor, I'm pretty good. If I went and did 10, I would get up and be like, whoa, my head would be bobbing around and stuff like that. But that got me thinking as well about, Cal, you had mentioned doing it between 1080s. And I think about this, I've had a few people, coaches, mentors, people talk about there's a limit to how many of the same thing in a row you can do. It's like this path of your nervous system. Like if I do fly 10 sprints or 30 meter excels or whatever, every one I do, I'm kind of starting to narrow the path of my system a little bit. And eventually you want to infuse something in to break that path back open. So I'd be curious. Is that what you're trying to do there? Or if Mike, you have anything to chime in with that? Because that is really interesting to me. And then how do you break that path back open? Do you do something else? Do you do something that's variable, and in what form? Curious with you guys' take on that.
Well, Joel, so what I'll do now is when at the beginning of summer one year, I just had the athletes, I'd muscle test them really quick. I do about 27 really fast just to see what muscles were on. I'd rank them really quick. And I can do that in about 40 seconds if somebody's taking notes of what I ranked the muscles tests. And then they go do the GOAT drill and they come right back within 30 seconds, get on the table, and I muscle test them. And it was literally like all the muscle tests went up. So literally the brain, I knew that there was activation of the muscles, even though we weren't doing anything activation, right? And then one of the magics I saw was, it was shocking. So I did the same thing without doing the GOAT drill once on the 1080 over speed, right? And Joel, I couldn't believe some of these muscles on a scale 1 to 10 went from a 4 to a 10 by pulling somebody over speed. So I realized then there's some level of activation of muscles that weren't working because they were terrified. Because what happened? The brain says, I'm being pulled at 103% or something. I'm scared. So it literally turns everything on to survive the drill, right? So I'm thinking, if I do RPR, I do the GOAT drill, intense, and then I'm doing the 1080, things are happening. Everything's literally turned on because everybody that walks off there, even if they've had, let's say, I had one female I talked about with a broken bone in her foot. We do all that stuff, and literally the drills, her muscles would turn on, and they had been on very well in years. You know what I mean? And it's just okay, I have a formula here to just get everything currently tuned up to where I think they need to be, right? So, and there's a level of fear there, obviously, right, Mike? I'm sure that plays a huge factor in just surviving the drill.
Yeah, and if you go too far, if you were to pull people, don't anyone listen to this and do this, but if you pull them at 110% or you pull them too fast, you're probably going to get massive shutdown, right? But there's that sweet spot. And we know this from some isometric testing. You can look at visualization drills where they try to trick people and they give them fake weights and all this stuff. At some point, if you're too far under, nothing happens. If you're right at and just a little bit above, you can eke out, probably single-digit % increase, which is massive. If you go too far, it's almost like, nope, that's it. I either know you're trying to lie to me, cheat to me, or I just can't do this at all. And that's it. I'm just shutting down completely. But there is definitely a sweet spot where you can still extract a fair amount of performance from them.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Lila Exogen Wearable Resistance. Exogen is used by coaches such as Randy Huntington and Chris Corfist and is an incredible tool in overloading the angular, momentum, and speed aspect of human movement. You can get 25% off of Exogen sleeves by heading to lilateam.com and using the code JustFly25. Yeah, it's interesting to look at that U curve of performance. I just like the idea of attention. It's like, and it's funny to think about. I mean, just thinking about things under the lens of attention, like overspeed, people will be like, oh, well, you can't pull them too fast. They might have too much braking force. It's going to mess up the sprint mechanics. And yeah, there might be a degree of that. That's certainly happening. But okay, we also look at the other layers of what's happening. And we also see, okay, wow, the brain is paying a lot of attention because it's a very, you're kicking in some survival things. And obviously, you don't want to tow too fast. I think there's sweet spots. I like the 100%, make it easier. There's certainly a lot of attention going on there, but just to think of things from what are the frames of that I'm making my innate system, not just like the external thinking, constantly strategizing brain, but how am I making that innate underlying system pay attention, and what's the maximum amount I can challenge that attention in different windows.
Joel, the one thing I noticed is that with the Go Drill, once I started implementing that, how you'd run kids and we'd watch the 1080 results and they keep getting a little better. What we found was that once we got the Go Drill implemented, it seemed that like people hit their top performance sooner and then stayed there. There was less deviation through the workout where they might have got better, right? So I'm like, okay, I think that's a good thing. They were hitting like really good top range, everything right out of the chute. There was no like, hey, it took them 3 reps to get their top speed today, right? Or whatever it may be. They were right there all the time. And I think it creates a consistency when you do that Go Drill, right? Because then everything's kind of locked in. That's just my quick opinion. It's just my thought and what we've seen over the years.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
And that makes sense. If you're much more coordinated, you're not using and spending energy on those, 1, 2, 3, 4 sprints or sets or whatever to try to figure out what you're doing. Like you can go, okay, here's the task at hand. Boom, I can nail this at 100% or whatever because I have much, much better coordination already. I don't need more reps to try to figure out the coordination to get to that high level.
Yeah, I'd be curious, Cal, what the 1080 data would look like in terms of variability, one rep to another, in the presence of, okay, you do a couple 1080 sprints, go do some Go Drill, some variability to wash it out, and then go back, versus, hey, you're just going to do 10 sprints in a row. And to me, it seems like athletes as a natural survival mechanism, if I have to do 10 maximal sprints in a row, the body's going to seek its own variability. It's going to be like, hey, I got to do this sprint a little different. I got to do this sprint a little different because if I do the same exact thing over and over and over again for 10 maximal sprints, I have a greater chance of injuring myself. And so it's like this multilateral recalibration. It also makes me think about just even, I mean, again, we do have different training situations and options, but the power of like, if you can go play a game for 10 minutes and then go do a sprint, that max fly, and then go play a game again for 10 minutes and go do that, that's extremely effective. And it's for very similar reasons. And
we're just trying to raise the ceiling of their athleticism, Joel, right? Because you want that ceiling raised, because then when you have to coach them, I truly feel that athletes have a better feel of their body when I describe, hey, you need to do this with this particular movement. It seems like they have that awareness greater. Like it makes you look like a better coach, really. And that's the goal, is that I look like a better coach maybe at some point. I really don't care what people think of me. It's more about what my athletes do and perform, and they're happy, right? But like ultimately, I have to coach them less with this drill. That's my opinion. That's what I see.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, with athletes and athlete performance. It is, I don't like to say the red pill because it's like so overused, but I mean, just that breakthrough is like, can I find things that make or allow me to need to talk less with coaching? Maybe I'm talking in the level of encouragement and other things, in an athlete's headspace as I help facilitate their session. But yeah, to find those places that you let the movement do the work and the athlete's subconscious and body do the work. So massive.
I found like this is probably generally true. I'd be curious in your guys' thoughts. Like the higher level coaches I watch, they all appear to talk less. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know of an extremely high-level coach that is like the motor mouth going all the time. It seems to be the exact inverse, which I think is definitely a skill to learn, because I have way overcoached people in the past to their detriment.
Yeah, I think we all have, and it's like you get to that point where you see the athlete that's just the wheels spinning, or like The visual Kevin Hollabaugh was on the podcast a long time ago talking about like that little Apple thing when your Mac gets stuck, like that little Mac wheel is just starting to spin.
Their eyes look like the deer in the headlights of a Peterbilt.
Yeah. And it's like, well, what do? You have to start thinking about that you overloaded attention. And
right.
Yeah. Hey, so I want to get into physiology, and because I'm like, wow, we've been talking about this for almost an hour, which is amazing. Like this is, but I did want to get into physiology. So just before we do, and we might not have as much time for it, and that's totally fine. But I did want to, so Cal, you had talked about the difference or advances, updates, Triphasic 1, Triphasic 2, and you had said you had moved towards more oscillatory work. So would you guys mind just touching very briefly, just, if we have 5 minutes, just talk about some oscillatory pieces? I know I'm sure people have seen videos and they're trimetric and, band type work, but just some of those oscillatory updates, some of the ideas behind them and how that's moved forward. And then I'd love to finish with talking about the physiology, increasing that motor pool with the capacity and the hybrid work. But yeah, talk about oscillatory just a little bit and how that's advanced throughout the years.
Yeah. Well, the big thing, Joel, is like if you look in the program, you look at the speed loading program. When I say speed, people think it's running. It's all my light loads between 50 and 25% load, or like putting your hand in a band over your head and violently, in between two bands, maybe, or multiple bands, put in parallel to the floor, and you put your hand in between them and you're violently moving. And what that people look at that, and if they actually looked at it, right? Mike was there when we did our Revolutions of Speed clinic, Chris and I, and we had the demonstrator put the shoulder in and do that in a quadruped position, and you could literally see every spine muscle just exploding, and like the glutes exploding to stabilize that, and in 5 seconds, that person could roughly get 15 repetitions. And the magic is that what we've seen with the TMG, our ability to measure that muscle to relax, we saw large levels of being able to train that relaxation factor in those movements. And to me, it's not just in those movements. Sure, it's a shoulder movement, but when you do 10 or 15 exercises at high speed velocity of turning a muscle on, because then the opposite muscle has to shut off, right? You're training the antagonist. I've just seen higher levels of coordination. When we say this, the athletes start that movement, maybe they get 11. And then 2 to 3 weeks, they might be getting 17 to 18 in that same movement. Is it a learned skill? Sure. But it's a skill that I truly believe that general athleticism, because again, I'm not trying to make them powerlifters. We all know that. I'm trying to make them the most athletic they can be, and that highly coordinated movements. And I truly believe that the brain's supposed to function at a high level, right? A high speed, right? Walking, it can be monotonous, but when you're sprinting, you're very aware of what's going on, even though you can walk and just be mindless, right? So I think the high speed movements is ultimately, after you get through the triphasic and everything else in the power phase, the high speed movements are what is magic and helps people be highly coordinated. And it really is actually what's going on right in the field. So if you get hit and your arm has to stabilize your shoulder, the faster that it can do that, the better off you are. And that's not straining with a 100-pound dumbbell overhead. In my opinion, that is violently going through 17 movements or 17 on and offs with your muscle in 5 seconds to better stimulate and prepare your body for that coordination and to absorb force and everything that it may be entailing, like encountering in the gym or in the field, right? So, and like I think people like that much better. Honestly, that type of training. So people say, "Well, yeah, but there's not much weight." Well, wait a minute. That arm is moving at 6 meters per second when you're flinging it like that, right? At some with the facilitation of the band, and if you actually put a EMG on the muscle, it is 100%, right? It's so much above a heavy 100-pound dumbbell, even though it's a brief 100th of a second, right? You're turning those muscles on, exploding them at max effort, and then they have to relax as fast as possible. And that's the magic. I mean, the Soviets found out that was the most elite humans they had were the people. It wasn't speed of contraction, muscle fibers. It was how fast the muscles could relax, what identified the best people. Now, that's not only at the muscle level with the sarcoplasmic reticulum that you're training, but also if you're not in control of your parasympathetic sympathetic system in your brain, if you can't calm down, then that's not going to happen either. So it's not just a local thing, it's a systemic thing, right? Not that with the exercise you're training systemic, because you need to be able to, and the best athletes a lot of times are the calmest, right? So they're in control of their parasympathetic system, because if they're sympathetic and they're overstimulated, that muscle's not going to relax as fast as you think, or it could naturally. Does that make sense? So the biggest thing with oscillatories is that we feel that our ability to stay injury free has been increased because of the high speed, because that's how the muscle's getting hurt, and that's how it's supposed to function on the field. Like, that's my basic gist of that. Like, that's my opinion on oscillatories. Mike could probably add a few more things.
Yeah, I was going to ask Mike anything, especially like, that parasympathetic, sympathetic balance, or anything that's more underlying to the ability to relax muscles quickly and achieve those, that cycling. I'm sure probably not, general population probably are less likely they're going to be doing quick oscillatory stuff, but I'm sure there's a place for variations of that. So I'd be curious what you have to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd answer more on a philosophical answer is I always look for, if you find a principle, it should be true across multiple domains, and it should be true across different aspects of physiology. So one of the things I like is, I call it HDR, human dynamic range. What is your biggest range? Let's say heart rate, lowest to highest, speed, range of motion, moving your arm from here to here. The second component is how far can you go? And then the second component then is how fast, right? This is everything from metabolic flexibility, carbohydrates on one end, fats to the other end. How fast can you switch back and forth? Sympathetic to parasympathetic, how fast can you go back and forth? Can you expand your range out on both sides? But with oscillatories, it fits that principle that what is your range of motion you can do, and then how fast within that range of motion can you execute it. So in general, the bigger range of motion you can control, and the faster you can move within that, or across different systems, or however you want to think of it, I think you're going to move in a better direction. And I think this is just the small version of that philosophy at a local muscle level. Last component too is, if we were talking about the GOAT drill, just think about the integrations into high-speed unconscious movement in athletics. So like Dr. Joe Clark did a study looking at visual training in a group of football players, and then I think he left the university there for a year, and they just compared it to rates of concussion. What they found is when they were doing visual training, the rate of concussion in football went down dramatically. And the hypothesis is, if you unconsciously at that last minute just turn or move just enough to lessen that impact, that's going to make a big difference. Now, again, I think those are all trained at an unconscious level too. So that ability to make those even fine scale adjustments, but they have to be reflexive, and usually have to be incredibly fast in order to do that. And I think those oscillatory mechanisms are also training a component of that. They have to be very fast, but they also have to be a subconscious, reflexive type nature.
Yeah, it's kind of a shift almost to, like, there's different types of intelligences, the ways that people can be intelligent. There's social intelligence and more like quantitative, mathematical, and then there's physical. There's the intelligence of the body. And I think so often we try to paste too much other types onto the physical, because the physical is so reflexive and reactive on this subconscious innate level. Just like you mentioned, that ability to process and then turn that head at the last second and make those subtle little adjustments. And, the way that, the brain pays attention in physical is just something, it's almost like its own skill in and of itself. And it's this way, you don't learn it in school. It's this thing you just start to understand as you start watching individuals move. It's,
and you'll see that in all high level athletics, right? I remember something Dr. Cobb said years ago, is that elite athletes make insane stuff look easy, right? But they're not. If you're a wide receiver in the NFL, you're not thinking about your mechanics to run after a pass. You're at a cognitive level of thinking about, okay, what route do you run? When do you want to run? Do you want to look off this guy? You're thinking about all the high level stuff of what you want the output to be. You're not in the minutia thinking, oh boy, my right calf needs to contract hard at this point, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I just think about how many little processes my body is doing while I'm doing the output.
Oh, it's insane.
It's
insane.
It's a supercomputer, right? That would eat up so much energy right now, our brain. Like the analogy was, it's a supercomputer on 2-3 blocks of city blocks, right? That would eat up so much energy that's going on in our brain right now, and it's so high functioning. The amount of information it's processing is terrifying. Like what, 4 gigabyte movies a second, something like that.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like that number might even grow the more we learn about it. Like people talk about some of these computational benchmarks for quantum computers, and where it's like a standard computer couldn't do it because the number has so many zeros. It's all the atoms on the surface of the Earth or something, but the quantum can't. Anyways, it's just I'm continually blown away by what the body can do underneath the surface, and I love the oscillatory piece too. The layers there, it's also like it's the ranges that you can move athletically, because I think sometimes we can do a lift or a movement and you can kind of twist your way into a range you're not innately powerful in. Maybe you aren't creating the space and the pressure correctly, but it's like, look, if you can oscillate in a space, you can pressurize it typically. You can function there. Everything can be integrated. And I think it's always the litmus test too, because, hey, I want you to get into this certain position. But then if you couldn't oscillate there well powerfully, how well do you own that position? Is it something that you just kind of twisted yourself into in a little bit of a weird way just to make the lift? Or do you own it on all levels of the body?
Yeah. Well, the other thing, Joel, I think people have to realize is, like, it was 3 summers ago. One of my Olympians, right? She's a 3-time Olympian. She kept testing, and we run our tests within, like we talk about in our book, our periodization model. We run a test and then we see what zone you're supposed to be in. She, out of 14 weeks, she tested into power 2 weeks, and the rest was in the speed, right? So she was only 50 to 25% load in the weight room, but doing high speed oscillatory everything. And when she goes to national camp, she came up to me. She said, "Hey, I got a national camp test. I want to make sure I'm still strong." And I'm like, I think you'll be fine. So she had not benched over 50%. It was more 25 to 50% for 12 weeks. And she goes in and hits her lifetime PR rep test at 185 for 5, but hadn't benched over 90 or 105 pounds the entire summer. Wow. Just did oscillatories at high speed. Yeah. Now, people have to realize those oscillatories, if she's doing a full range rep, she is pulling 100 pounds down, stopping it, reversing it instantly. So there's like 300 pounds of force when she instantly stops it, right? Or she does, maybe it's 25 pounds on a Friday. She's doing a 6-inch oscillatory range of motion. When she brings the 75 pounds down or 50, it turns into 200 pounds when you're reversing it that fast and that hard, but she's doing it at a high speed, right? So I think, and so but the point was, she got stronger and hit her lifetime PR in her rep tests by doing the oscillatories at light load. So it's not like you lose dysfunction of strength even. Now, younger kids, maybe a little bit, but my more mature athletes won't. So don't get beyond the premonition. Make sure people understand, let's just not lift heavy weights. Let's just not, there's other ways to do it. I would take a little weaker athlete that's a lot better athleticism than somebody that's stronger that isn't such a great athlete every time. We see that. We know who wins in the field, right? We know who wins the medals. We know who wins the competition, the better athletes.
Yeah. That's one of the things I've asked coaches for, going on 2 decades now. Like, who is your best athletes, and are they your best athletes in the weight room on conventional lifts? And pretty much across the board, every single time was, my starters are not the best athletes by limit strength in the weight room. And that's always kind of bugged me. I'm like, okay, you need to be strong. Yes, all the things matter. But, especially then talking to Cal, it's like, what are these other components we're just leaving on the table? Because all these coaches keep telling me that, yes, weight training is important. I 100% agree. But yet they're also telling me that their strongest athletes are not the starting athletes either. So I'm like, there's some disconnect there.
Yeah. That's something that always comes back. I remember Corey Schlesinger talking about that. Is like, if your best athletes are, if you're selecting lifts that your bottom athletes are better at, then ultimately you want to be looking at, what those top athletes can be the most successful at. And as we've just been going through the conversation, I just think about things that kind of the anchors are things that are kind of like a goat drill, multi-perceptual, movement-oriented, oscillatory, or even things too with probably like how fast are you with the game implement too, like dribbling a basketball or something like that, versus without. And so, it's interesting as we evolve to explore that, like all the integrated pieces where all the pieces have to come together. And this is what makes the difference here. I want to get going on this the capacity piece because it's hour 10. This could be its whole conversation, so I feel like I will unfortunately sell it short in a little bit. But okay, so capacity, speed. I think a lot of times idealistically, sometimes these can sit on opposite ends. And if we want to be fast, well, how much endurance should we train? But maybe we can start. I'd be curious because this was in the book. Capacity for power. Maybe starting there. What do you guys look at if it comes to setting the physiological baseline for future fast twitch outputs and things like that?
You want to jump, Mike, or you want me to?
I'll start at a basic level and you can expand it from there.
Yeah.
I think we need to go back to, in a perfect world, what are the capacities and the qualities you need in order to train, right? And so one of the things I remember watching, I don't know, it was like a 45-minute thing. Cal's like, doing this thing on the whiteboard. And I remember I was supposed to write an article on it for the Triphasic 2 book. And I'm sitting there going, okay, crap. How the hell am I going to explain this to anyone else who's not sitting in this room watching this 45-minute video of this? And so I asked him at the end, I'm like, okay, so you're saying do the highest quality output first and then just repeat that. And he's like, yeah, that's right. So if you want to get faster, you want to get more powerful, you have to hit those numbers or hit that output, but you probably are not going to be an elite level athlete by doing that just once. And especially if you're not already just some genetic freak anyway, you need to do it again and again and again. You need to get high quality reps in. But what a lot of times is the rate limiter to get high quality reps in, it's actually the aerobic system, the ability of your body to regenerate ATP, to get all these systems back to baseline so that you can execute again at that highest level. So I think a lot of times people misinterpret the role of the aerobic system in that, we're training a hammer thrower or whatever. They don't need any aerobic stuff. Well, no, they probably don't need a lot compared to other athletes, but they need enough to ensure that they can do high quality training output. Even with some of the athletes I work with, I've lost track now of how often athlete comes in, they're like, I don't know what happened. Like, I used to be able to train, 5-6 days a week, and now I can't. My sleep's good, everything else is good, my blood work's fine. We run the VO2 max, and it's like friggin' 21. And I'm like, well, that's why. Like, you just have such a small aerobic engine that you don't have a big enough energy to get back to baseline fast enough to get enough high quality work in to see the output that you want.
Cal, you got anything there?
Yeah. Well, I think so many people convolute those two, the speed and capacity, right? As Mike talked about building that capacity. And, the objective, I've always felt that I needed to be able to build capacity in, let's say you can have a great aerobic base, but that your power capacity. So let's say you're going to push a sled with 100 pounds for 10 seconds, take 30 seconds off and do it again. And you drop so fast, even though you're in great physical shape. So I have always felt that you need to do the intensity. And really, we're looking at what is called repeated sprintability, right? But that capacity in the power zone to reproduce that effort is probably what a lot of football linemen may need, or just in a football game versus the aerobic base. I think we can all agree to that. But the speed factor, the main difference between building the fitness level of capacity and power, and let's say a power output for max effort with highest quality, it's just the rest that you have to be able to repeat the highest level. So really the biggest component of power capacity versus power high quality, which would be speed or power output, increased power output, is that you have a little more time. Now, I feel like most people need to build their power capacity, and then you can do the same methods, but then you just have to increase the quality of the rest to make sure that you can reproduce that effort. And you're not working on a motor task, because you can't learn anything or do anything well once you're tired. We know this, right? Like, it's just not possible. There might be things you have to do when you're tired, and you need to be able to learn to do those, but you're not doing it well, to say the least. So the capacity part, and it's not just physiology, right? It's well, I shouldn't say that, but like, it's not just the heart and the cardiopulmonary. It's the nervous system in the brain to be able to apply a signal at a high rate too. So it's full encompassing from the nervous system to the lungs, to the vascular system, to the microcirculation, to the brain. You have to build that capacity up. And I know a lot of people say, hey, yeah, like sprinters, they don't need. Well, if the only sport you play is sprinting in high school, but I'm telling you, if you have that capacity and you build that, you have to have intense capacity, not just aerobic capacity. That intense capacity, which would be, the ability to repeat it again and again. I know that a lot of research has shown that teams at the end of the game, if the skill's pretty relevant, the team that's the fastest at the end of the game and can reproduce that sprint is going to win. And that capacity is a big factor.
Yeah. Looking at like balance and Mike, with you mentioning the aerobic system, which I've become more and more of a believer in, kind of you polarize things and you put them back together and you think about how much are we doing here. Talking with Mark McLaughlin and him being on the podcast a few times and really into like omega wave and those metrics. And you mentioning VO2 max as well. I haven't measured my VO2 max since I was in graduate school. And when I measured there, it was actually quite high. But sometimes I sit and wonder, and maybe this is a little different because if you have team sport athletes, they're playing their sport. Like that is repeat power and capacity ability wrapped up in a very meaningful situation as well. But I would, in just years and years and years post-grad school of just sprinting, jumping, and lifting, and not doing, not playing a lot of team sports consistently, not doing a whole lot of running. For me, it's always been the team sports, way more motivating to build that capacity in that sense. But I wonder how much my VO2 max did creep in, because partly you hit a point where you can do the workouts, but it's how well are you recovering from them week to week to week? And even like a level of energy within the training itself. There's even something to, this isn't something I necessarily would have athletes do, but even if you just go for a run for a couple miles and finish with some sprint buildups at the end, there's something about the feeling of those sprint buildups. They're not necessarily the fastest, but you just know that you're just going to walk off of them and feel great. Like you're totally recovered. They're not like, it's just a different sense of thinking about that. And I think about capacity wrapped up in sport. You do a little jogging, a little shuffling, boom, sprint. Kind of like the goat drill, almost. A little jog, a little shuffle, boom, sprint. And it's like, it's this capacity and power rolled up into a single shot. But in terms of the balance and aerobic system, I know Mark had talked about like the tempo volumes and things like that. So in terms of maybe weighing how much outside of sport am I doing to maintain those qualities? How do I know it's good? Any metrics? Mike, you mentioned the VO2. Any metrics? Any thoughts? Any of balance on how much is good and how much should we be doing to ensure a solid level of recovery? I know it varies sport to sport as well, but any general guidelines or principles there?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things I look at is heart rate variability at baseline. In general, the more developed your aerobic system is, the higher your HRV or the better your HRV will be. More on the parasympathetic side. Again, this is per individual. It's a huge amount of variability from HRV from one athlete to the next. If you go all the way up to very close to a max effort and then do heart rate recovery, so how you hit like a peak and then how fast does your heart rate come back down to baseline at rest? There's a 1 and 2 minute standard test, like the Garmin. If you have a Garmin watch, it'll do a 2-minute test. That's a pretty good indicator of what's called parasympathetic reactivation. Yes, some of that is based on your stress you're experiencing at that time, but it's also a good indicator of your aerobic system. If you have a known output that you can quantify, so like I do a lot of work with the rower just because it's a full body movement, there's no impact, and it automatically gives everybody data. So it's very easy for me to get data that is standardized from an athlete in Australia to the UK to the US, if it's a Concept 2 rower. If I have them do like a 30-second output, how long and how many high quality intervals can they do? If I'm expecting them to hit, 350 watts on average, if they rest for 4 minutes and they hit, 340, and then after that, doesn't matter how long they rest, they can't do it anymore. That's an indicator versus short rest periods. So those are some of the things that I would look at. In general, you're looking at what output it is. You could do this on a 1080. What is the rest period? And then how close can they hit that number again? And again, like Cal said, I like the VO2 max as just a rough proxy of a ballpark. I'm going to throw a thing at the dartboard and see where you're at. If you're super low, yeah, we probably need some GPP. We need some stuff to bring that up. if you're good and you're still missing in the quality of the sport that you want, like Cal said, then you're going to do more specific stuff for that, because you've got the underlying engine. It just needs to be a little bit more kind of tuned up now for the specificity that you want to do.
Yeah. Joel, to getting back to you in college, right? I assume you did a more higher volume program. And for me, that's what I like in the weight room. You know, when people look at my programs in the gym, and I don't think it'll fall into play until you actually look at like, hey, here's 12 exercises. Here's an athlete going through it. And he gets it done in 5 minutes, 30 seconds, those 12 exercises, right? But you can see how they're set up. And like, some days, if we're doing auto regulation, some of my athletes might do that set 5 to 6 times. So they got 60 exercises done of 7 or 10 seconds, maybe. And people are like, and it's a sprint, but and again, you're doing an X body part for 10 seconds, and then you switch to another body part. So you're systemically moving around. And people look at my programs, and they're a lot, but the fitness levels of my athletes, you know, the freshmen, they come in and they're only doing 2 sets or 3 of it to start out with. My seniors are doing 4 to 5, maybe 6 even. So it takes time over time. But this is why I love favoring a high volume weight program in the gym, because that actually can take away some of the capacity work of conditioning that you don't have to do year round to keep them at a certain fitness level. Right? Because during that time frame, if my athletes, I'm not kidding you, there's athletes that might do 100 sets one day with me. Now we're talking grip, neck, calves, everything, right? But they haven't done conditioning in months, 2 months, let's say, and their resting heart rate's at 40 at night, 38, and they're that fit because of the high volume that we've done in the weight program, right? Of doing everything. So I think it's a happy medium, but ultimately, the greater the capacity, the more, and then I view it as the more capacity. When we get into the season, if you've built a great capacity in the off season wisely, then the margins for error are greater. If a coach has a big, if it's a hard series of games or the flu hits the team, well, we can still win this series, even though, right, that as long as we have a great work capacity. Like that's, to me, that all my great athletes, the high work capacity has been always a one big thing that's very important.
Yeah. I feel
they're
like
just more resilient.
Yeah.
I think the efficiency is so big too, just because it in a way you could think, I think of this sometimes, weigh it against an extra half hour of sleep that you could get. You know, if I could get a little bit more of this in the weight room from this perspective, and I don't have to spend an extra hour a week doing it or whatever, then that's hopefully an hour more you could sleep on the week. And it's just always, I mean, I think athletes always stretch so much in those directions. So, hey, well, that was, in terms of, I know I have a few more questions and things like that, but I think that's a great place to leave it off. And before we get out of here, I know the book's out, Triphasic 2, if you guys want to talk about where people can find that. And we'll finish the show off there.
We have it on Triphasic Training II.com is where you can go get it.
Triphasic2.com.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Is it the letter? Is it the number 2, or is it 2?
It's 2. Yeah, training Triphasic 2. The number.com. So, and that's where you can get it. You can probably find it really quick too with a Google search. And then we're excited about it. We get a lot of emails. It's good stuff. Like we were able to tie a lot of things together for people, weren't we, Mike? Like those are some pretty gratifying things that we've been able to say, oh man, this is good stories. We're glad people are excited and using it. So
yeah, and the thing I think that they'll get from the book that they won't get from the videos or anything, that was the hardest part that took freaking forever, was how do you put all this stuff into a system that someone can pick up a book and go like, oh, okay, here's how it's executed, here's the flow, here's the progressions, here's the regressions. And so we did it in terms of, turn on, train, and then transfer. So things like RPR for turn on, go to real warm-ups, training, different methods, supermax method, etc. And then transfer, here's all these different techniques to make sure that this transfers to the field. So that was the part that took the longest time of getting everything laid out so that when they pick it up, they're like, oh, wow, this, angular shank method in the transfer. Oh, I can just drop this into my program right now. So we tried not to make it, there are a bunch of programs people can get through the accompanying PDF, but we tried to make it much more principle based and give them an outline of things that they can go through and take like the goat drill and add that in, or they can take the supermax method, or how you do the tri-block method, and take singular things out and apply it to their training. And then over time they can keep coming back and adding more and more things to it, which is a little bit different than the Triphasic 1 book, which was more of here's this new system and here's how it's kind of laid out from soup to nuts. Now that people are really good with that, here's 14 other methods they can now layer on top of that.
Well, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, guys. And I have my copy here, so appreciate it, and appreciate the talk too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.